The first of the 2025 NFL win totals have been floated out there, and right now the Chargers are projected 10.5 wins, and they will have to be a lot better than they were last year if they want to hit 11 again.
You are Locked On Chargers, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Chargers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, and welcome into the Locked On Chargers podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Wade, joined as always by my co-host, David Droegemeier, and we've been covering the Chargers for 9 seasons now, but this is our 7th year as the host of the Locked On Chargers podcast, bringing you your team every day. Thank you to the everydayers out there for making us your first listen. To make sure that you never miss the show, go subscribe or follow for free on the Locked On Chargers YouTube channel and listen wherever you get your podcast from. David, what do we got today?
Well, Daniel, for the Chargers to be able to get to 11 wins once again this upcoming season, it's going to take a much better performance against the good teams in the NFL, and they're going to have a lot of cracks at it as they have 9 games against playoff teams in 2025. And so that also leads us into what has the AFC West been up to in this offseason. What are the moves that they've made? Have they gotten better? Have they gotten worse? Have the Chargers been able to keep pace, or have they put themselves in position to have a better year in 2025?
That is the question. I think right now the Chargers have definitely kept pace, but they're going to have to hit big in the draft if they want to take that next step. But today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. David, 10.5 was the number that I saw floating around about the Chargers win total in 2025. And I think that when I saw that number, you think, oh, well, they had 11 wins last season, right? So you would think they should be able to do that again, but it's not quite that simple. And no 2 NFL seasons are the same. And I think that the Chargers, if they were to hit 11 wins, would have to be much better than they were in 2025. And I think even if they finish with the same amount of wins, it would be indicative of a team that's figured some things out. But I was a little bit surprised when I read the Chargers.com article talking about their win projection, that they were second, at least as far as the most wins that they're projecting for any team, or I guess fifth, depending on how you look at it. But there were only 4 teams, the Chiefs, the Eagles, the Bills, and the Ravens, that had a higher projection, which I think shows kind of the respect that the Chargers are getting in year 2 of Jim Harbaugh.
Absolutely. And hey, how else could you look at it when you take a team that had 5 wins the previous season and add 6 wins to their win total in 1 year and completely change the culture, change the way that the organization is seen from the outside, and also how the players view it from the inside as well, and change the mentality and how they play football, into a more physical, hard-nosed brand of football. And it worked out for the Chargers a lot better this past season as they were able to get into the playoffs. So a lot of respect out there for Jim Harbaugh, for Joe Ortiz, and ultimately the direction that the Chargers are heading.
Yeah, and I mean, FanDuel last year had them at 8.5, and they smashed that, right? Getting to 11 wins. We'll see if it's at 10.5 on FanDuel this year. It's going to be tough, and I think part of that respect and maybe a little bit of the surprise there when you see them only, trailing those teams that we know to kind of be the juggernauts in the NFL the last few seasons is the schedule is a lot tougher. Like, it's going to be a lot harder to hit that number in 2025 because of the teams that they now have on their schedule coming up, because we don't know what the schedule is yet, but we know who the opponents are. And I guess the nice thing is they're getting a lot of their toughest opponents at home, but there's a lot more really, really tough opponents, David, on their schedule, which is why it makes it so tough to be like, hey, the Chargers are definitively going to go 11 plus wins next year.
It is. And I mean, you don't have to really look much further than your own division, because there's 2 other playoff teams that were in the AFC West last year with the Chiefs and the Broncos. So
4 built
right then and there,
schedule.
that's 4 games against playoff teams just right off the rip. And then if you look at it in totality, it's 9 games against playoff teams. And as you mentioned, a good thing is at least 7 of those 9 games is going to be at home at SoFi. So that definitely is a big advantage, because obviously we know some of those fan bases out there are pretty crazy. And I think at least for the Chargers, the last couple of years, they've done a much better job of having something more resembling a home field advantage. And so that's definitely been encouraging. And I think there is a lot of excitement out there. Obviously, after the season that the Chargers had didn't really finish the way a lot of fans would have wanted or hoped for.
Sure.
But still, big improvement. And, it's going to have to take a much more Herculean effort this upcoming season to be able to get to the playoffs again this year.
And not all playoff teams are created equally, right?
Absolutely
like you obviously get 4 in your division. You beat the Broncos twice last year. But in those 9 teams, in those 9 games you now have against playoff teams, we're talking about outside of the ones, right, that are inside your own division. You're talking about not just 2 of the teams or both teams that were in the NFC Championship game this year, because you get the NFC East, so you're getting not only the Super Bowl champion Eagles, but also the Washington Commanders, who were the runner-ups in the NFC. But now you have 3 of the 4 conference, champions or teams that made it to the conference championship on your schedule next year. And they will get 9 home games, but also one of them, presumably against a playoff team, is going to be in Brazil too. I think that if you're looking for kind of the silver linings, like, I guess at least you get the AFC South. I think that's like one place where you'd say that's not the worst draw that you could get in the AFC. Obviously, last year you had the North, so you had the Bengals and the Steelers and the Ravens, and you stayed away from 2 of the top 3 teams in the AFC because you don't have the Ravens this year and you don't have the Bills on the schedule. That's where you kind of get some reprieve. But I think looking at the AFC South specifically, that's where some of the presumed easier games are going to come in when you're talking about the Jaguars and whatever that mess looks like this year, the Titans, who have the number 1 overall pick in the draft, and the Colts, who, if you're telling me it's a competition, it might be Daniel Jones at quarterback for the Indianapolis Colts. That's not a game that scares me very much. But I'd say that is one kind of nice thing. But you also get, because you were second place in the AFC West, you get not only, right, a Minnesota Vikings team that was a playoff team, but a 14-win playoff team. Like, most seasons when you get second place, you're not worried about the team you get next year to have 14 wins. But that's the kind of unique situation. And we'll see. Because some of these teams could also drop off too, and that's what we talk about every year. Vikings with J.J. McCarthy. Steelers don't have a quarterback right now, and they're on the schedule, which is also, the second place team you get from the AFC North because of that second place scheduling you get. Yeah. But at the end of the day, David, it comes down to this. If the Chargers want to hit 11 wins this year and go over, they have to be able to beat good teams, because that was their kryptonite easily in 2024.
Hey, step 1 in the blueprint was beat the teams that you're supposed to beat. Check. They did that last year at a much higher clip. I think probably the only game that you could say that probably got away from them was the Arizona Cardinals game.
Absolutely.
Outside of that, they took care of their own business. Now, when it comes to the teams that had plus 500 records, the Chargers did not fare very well at all. The only team that they really beat that had a plus 500 record was the Denver Broncos, and they beat them twice. Outside of that, they lost to every single other good, quote-unquote, football playoff team that they had on the schedule last year. So to take that next step, to graduate to that upper echelon level, to be one of those top teams, you have to beat those top teams at a much higher clip than the Chargers have the last several seasons. That's the next step. You start doing that, then you can start kicking the door down and start trying to make some hay in the playoffs.
Yeah, because it was still kind of what the theme for them was under Brandon Staley, especially in that last year. I don't think they beat a playoff team. Maybe they beat one, or even the last couple of years. Yeah, they really didn't do well against.
There's not a lot of good teams. Wins against good teams.
No, especially after that first season where they kind of surprised some people. But I do think for this to happen, you have to be able to beat good teams. I think you have to split at least against the Chiefs if you're going to hit 11 in 2025. Yeah. And I mean, it wasn't just the fact that, you went 2-5 against those playoff teams last year, because you could also throw the Bengals in there, who weren't a playoff team, but finished over 500 as a pretty good team. And you beat them kind of at the height of their powers right when they were starting to get hot. But you also got smoked by the Buccaneers. You got smoked by the Ravens. You weren't really that close against the Chiefs. I mean, obviously a doink field goal, but they were beat in that game, right? Yeah. It's about the defense playing a lot better versus the great offenses. And it's about the offense not disappearing against good defenses. And that's the step the Chargers have to take if they want to start beating better teams and hit that 11-win threshold that almost guarantees you a playoff spot in 2025. But we still have more to get into, including how the AFC West got a lot better. And that's another thing that's in their way in 2025, including the Raiders, who made the biggest moves, and the Broncos, who took a couple of pretty big risks. And we're getting into that and more in today's Locked On Chargers podcast. Imagine watching your favorite team live, feeling the energy of the crowd, and witnessing unforgettable moments. There's nothing like experiencing a big game in person. And when we look for big game tickets, there's only one place we go, and it's Game Time. Because getting tickets shouldn't be stressful, and that's where Game Time comes in, because it makes it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. And they also have Game Time Picks, which filters out the fluff and only shows you the most incredible deals available. And when you're talking about going to game-changing type of games, when you're talking about unforgettable memories, you want to make sure you have the best experience. And that's why I love that you get the seat views with Game Time. So you're not going to get stuck there and be in seats that you thought were going to be a lot better. You also get, with that, the Game Time guarantee. If you're going to spend good money on a game that's really important to you, you want the Game Time guarantee, which will credit you 110% of the difference if you find it cheaper elsewhere in the same section and row for less. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. David, one thing that we haven't done so far this offseason is talk about what the rest of the AFC West has done. And last year, the Chargers were second, as we just illustrated. But the Broncos were good. They were a playoff team. And the Raiders had the biggest moves of the offseason in the AFC West by far. How much better did they get? We're going to talk about it a little bit, but I think it is important to kind of go over what the rest of the AFC West has done and then compare it to, at the end, what the Chargers were able to do and how much they were able to improve their team comparatively. So when you're talking about teams that, made the biggest impact with their offseason, David, it's easily the Raiders, because they upgraded at the two most important positions, or two of the most important positions on a football team. Their head coach, because they went from Josh McDaniels, who turned into Antonio Pierce, and now they have Pete Carroll, who's very old but still has the energy of one of the youngest coaches in the league, and not only has beef with Justin Herbert, but it was a legitimate head coach that you feel like even, will have a chance to turn around a disaster franchise that the Raiders have been for 25 years. He has that potential. He could do it. And then you get Geno Smith, which was crazy to me that the Seahawks decided to do that. Honestly, it makes me upset because, you're going to trade away Geno Smith just to go sign Sam Darnold to a 3-year, $100 million deal, as if that's the key? As if Kevin O'Connell wasn't pulling the strings in Minnesota and got the easily best version out of him? And you're going to trade him to a Chargers division rival for a 3rd-round pick? For, a legitimate, even if you're a hater of Geno Smith, a legitimate top 15 quarterback at the very least. Competence at the quarterback position at the very least, which is something the Chargers haven't had since Derek Carr, and he's better than Derek Carr in my opinion. So you're talking about the biggest moves in the AFC West. It starts there because now the Raiders don't seem like as much of a layup as they did last year when the Chargers handled them both times easily.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, last year when I saw the Raiders on the schedule, it was all about, first and foremost, beating the brakes off of them and getting a little bit of payback. I mean, that's definitely something I wanted. And fortunately, I was in attendance to enjoy that beautiful victory. Obviously, the margin of victory was nowhere near as much as it was that previous game, but it felt just as nice.
63-21 has never felt as good as it has, not only when they hired Jim Harbaugh, but every game since then.
Exactly. Absolutely. And so being able to handle the Raiders was great. Being able to just chalk up an automatic W was fantastic, but that's no longer the case. They do have a competent coach that has won at pretty much every level and everywhere that he's been, whether it's been college football or multiple stops in the NFL. The guy knows how to coach. That is clear and obvious by his track record of results that he's been able to get. And Geno Smith, no matter how you view any of the quarterbacks that the Raiders have played over the last, 7, 8, 10, 12 years, he's probably the best one that they've had in all of that span. So this guy is competent. He actually can make throws. He can evade. He can keep you in football games, and he can win you football games. Yeah. Now, still have work to do on the supporting cast for sure, but to be able to get a starting quarterback for a 3rd-round pick is insane. Now, there's no long-term contract here. It's a 1-year deal as far as everyone is concerned here, but competence at coach and quarterback makes the Raiders a team you actually have to game plan for, worry about, and be take seriously when you see them on your schedule.
Yeah, they're a team. I mean, depending on the draft, that could beat you now. Like, you can't take it easy. You have to go out there and play your best, I think. And I think as far as how the rest of the roster fared during this free agency, obviously they had to take on a pretty big chunk of what, Geno Smith's getting paid now, and they weren't paying a quarterback anything last year. But they ended up signing safety Jeremy Chin from Washington, Raheem Mostert, Landon Roberts, Eric Stokes. Nothing that moved the needle in my mind. But even though they had the two biggest moves, they also had some really key losses too, especially on the defensive side, on a defense that wasn't very good. I mean, I wish they would have traded Max Crosby. That would have been pretty great. But they lost Nate Hobbs, who's been their best corner over the last several seasons. They also lost their best safety and linebacker as well, both their linebackers, but their best safety and linebacker. Of the players that played at least 200 snaps for them last year per PFF, they lost their highest graded linebacker, safety, and cornerback, and overall on their defense, their third, fourth, and seventh best defenders. So they made some big moves, but this is still a team, David, as far as the timeline goes, that has a lot of work.
Oh yeah, they definitely do. Yeah, they just to put kind of names to those names to those players we're talking about. Yeah. It's Robert Spillane, Trayvon Mayrig, Divine Diablo, and of course Nate Hobbs that you mentioned. Nate Hobbs is probably the crown jewel of those players, was the best player of that group, and a guy that made some plays against the Chargers. So like he was a solid player, and now he is going to be playing for another football team, which, hey, that's great for me. Anytime good players leave the Raiders is definitely a positive thing here. But it's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done. They need to add weapons on offense. They need protection up front. They have to add some playmakers on defense. Like they're definitely headed in the right direction, but they are very much at the beginning of their rebuilding journey.
Absolutely. And they have some pieces, right? They have Geno Smith now. You have Brock Bowers, who just set every record, might be already the best tight end in football, especially as a receiver. They have some things to work with. Jackson Powers-Johnson, another guy that we like. But overall, outside of those two big moves, it's hard to find where they had clear upgrades over what they had last season. And I think that's important. The Broncos, on the other hand, they went out and maybe not any of the, big time names, but they definitely took some big time swings. Obviously, most notably, stealing Evan Ingram for the Chargers, who, visited both those teams, ended up elsewhere in the AFC West. And they spent big, David, and they took some risky swings on what is a pretty good roster that was a playoff team last year.
Yeah, they didn't really lose anybody, which is something that we talked about before we, started
kept that
the
core
show.
together, for sure.
Yeah, they kept most of that team together, and then they just kind of added. I guess they felt like, hey, we have a good group, like a core group of guys. Like maybe we can afford to take a couple of chances on some players that have some pretty significant injury histories, right? Like, linebacker Drake Greenlaw barely played any snaps last year. I mean, he barely touched the field. He got hurt and missed most of the season. And they rewarded him with a 3-year, $31.5 million contract. Now, the couple years before that year, he did have 145 plus tackles in each of those 2 seasons before last season. But, obviously, whenever you get up there in age and you get hurt, it's harder to come back from those. And then, of course, Telefano Hufanga, another player, to another 3-year, $39 million contract, who has missed a lot of time. He's missed a lot of time recently. He's a quality player. He's a former All-Pro, right? So he does have a track record of success to speak about. But, anytime you're coming back from these major injuries, and who knows if you're going to be able to get back to that level of prominence, or if you're going to be able to have to find a new normal and kind of reinvent yourself. We'll have to see how that goes for the Broncos.
Absolutely. I agree with you on all points there. I think it's weird because it's kind of like they're trying to take pieces from, a 49ers defense that was elite at one point and started kind of falling apart. And in some part because of the injuries to the two big free agents they had, Hufanga and Dre Greenlaw, obviously both coming from San Francisco. But yeah, those two guys missed 25 combined games in 2024. That's,
it's a lot of time.
Means they only played in 9 games between the two of them. Dre Greenlaw only played in 2 games after coming back from a torn Achilles that I believe he got either late in the season the year before or in the playoffs the year before. It really sucked.
Yeah.
Might have even been the Super Bowl. I don't remember.
I think it was. It was early in the Super Bowl.
I think it was in the Super Bowl, which it was a huge loss for them. Hufanga hasn't been the same player since his All-Pro season a couple of years ago because he's dealt with those injuries. they're kind of going in a very opposite approach to what the Chargers did in free agency, where they put a huge premium on durability, going and getting a guy like Najee Harris, who's never missed a game, going to get a guy like Mekhi Becton, who's only, has missed one game in each of the past 2 seasons. With the moves, they decided to kind of make big moves on. And the Broncos are taking a very good roster, a very solid roster, and taking some swings. Now, we've seen in the past the Chargers trying to make moves like this, get those 3-year older veterans to come in, and maybe they're the difference. And it didn't end up working out that way. These are different players, obviously, but there's definitely risk there. And I think what it's going to come down to, honestly, the most for the Broncos is they're going to have a good team. They have draft picks, to add to it. It's going to be about if Bo Nix takes a step and becomes a better quarterback in year 2, or if he has a sophomore slump. It's probably going to dictate how much better or worse they are in this upcoming season. But we still have more to get into because, David, I think the Chiefs might have gotten worse. But did the Chargers close the gap? We're getting into all that and more in today's Locked On Chargers podcast. Thank you again to the everydayers out there, as always, for checking out the show. And it's great to be able to talk about these other teams and kind of where the Chargers fit in amongst the big moves that we've seen so far in the AFC West. And to the everydayers out there, make sure you guys are back here tomorrow for Fan Mail Friday, where we already got a good one that we're cooking right now, which is Cam Scatterboo to the Chargers. But as always, thank you for making us your first listen. Hit us up at Locked On LAC with your fan mail questions tomorrow, or wherever you can find this show. You can leave us a question there. If you need a second listen, make sure to check out the guys on Locked On NFL Draft, Keith Sanchez and Damian Parson. Hoping to get one of those guys on next week, but that's how I've been keeping up with all the latest draft news as we've been going through free agency on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast from. Let's talk about the Chiefs, David, because that is obviously the cream of the crop. The team who's been to 3 straight Super Bowls and won 2 of them. The team that's won the AFC West 17 years in as many years back as I can remember.
My
I mean,
goodness.
they've been the crown of the AFC West, and the Chargers got close in 2018. They were both 12-4, and they ended up having the tiebreaker over them. But I think they may have gotten worse, David, in this offseason. And I think when you see teams like the Eagles and the Chiefs and teams who keep really good rosters and have really good players, you're going to lose those players, especially when you have highly paid quarterbacks. But you look at those losses that they have, David. I mean, there's some big names and some key contributors to those Super Bowls that are headed elsewhere in 2025.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest one of them is figuratively and literally. It's Joe Tooney. Joe Tooney is one of the monster offensive linemen that, he played guard for them, even kicked out to tackle when, they rotated 3 or 4 guys out there left tackle trying to find somebody. He was able to stabilize at least for a little while, get them where they wanted to go, obviously getting to the Super Bowl. Yeah. But that was a big loss, and they traded him for next to nothing, which was kind of crazy to me. Kershawn Wharton, one of their kind of key defensive tackles, he signed with the Carolina Panthers, got a big contract from them. And then, of course, safety Justin Reed, one of their, really, really good defenders on the back end. He also signed elsewhere and took his services somewhere else. And those are key major pieces. Those are all starters for the Kansas City Chiefs. And so looking at those losses, I mean, and kind of comparing to some of the people that they brought in, it's really easy to kind of deduce that this is a team that got worse.
Yeah, and they've answered the bell before, right? But I think one thing you could argue, though, is that the attrition is kind of taking its toll, each of the last 3 seasons, or has begun to kind of decline, at least in a sense, because this was the worst Kansas City Chiefs team we've seen in the last 3 years. Maybe one of the worst ones we saw in the Patrick Mahomes era. Now, it's still a team that made it to the Super Bowl. There's a reason they're the cream of the crop and the crown jewel of this division. But it was a team that kind of felt a little fraudy and then got exposed in the Super Bowl by who was a great team with the Philadelphia Eagles. They have 4 top 100 picks. They're going to have to hit on those picks if they want to continue to kind of be that at the top of the AFC. But they have to, right? That's what it's going to take, because Joe Tooney, one of the things about the Chiefs that was so frustrating is that interior trio between him, Creed Humphrey, and Trey Smith was just totally neutralizing to most defenses. And it's funny because that's part of what let them down, because they had to move Joe Tooney out to left tackle for the playoff run in the Super Bowl, and they ended up just getting destroyed in the Super Bowl. But that's a big loss. And I would have taken him for that deal in a heartbeat. They would have never sent him to the Chargers, obviously, Joe Tooney.
Never.
But Justin Reed, with how Steve Spagnuolo plays at that defense, that's a big loss for them. I mean, DeAndre Hopkins, was either second best receiver last year. He's out the door. Kershawn Wharton, Derek Nottie, both guys who have been part of a very formidable defensive front next to Chris Jones. Those are big losses for sure.
Yeah.
The biggest upgrade they potentially had was left tackle Jalen Moore, and it's a risky one. I mean, it's an upgrade seemingly because of just how bad all their left tackles were last year to get to Joe Thuney playing that position in the Super Bowl. But it's a guy who's a career backup for the most part, David. And I think if you look at kind of what they added, I don't know if it makes up for what they lost, especially when you sign Jerry Tillery, which I know is on the contrary to what you normally hear. That's subtraction by addition. Which I did think signing Jerry Tillery is subtraction by addition. So I look at these key signings. It's great to bring back Trey Smith. That's a big move for them, but you lose Joe Thuney and you go out and get Christian Fulton, right? But when you look at that, I mean, there's not much there that really moves the needle for me.
Yeah, no, not for me at all. I mean, you're getting a left tackle that's barely started in the NFL, and you gave him $15 million per season. So that's the expectation that he's coming in to be your left tackle to start right away. And so that, I think that's definitely a risk. I mean, that's a risk for sure after, hey, you had to try something, right? You had to try something because
the bar is low.
Yeah. You had 4 guys that you rotated in there last year, and really none of them were good. So if you even get somewhat of an uptick in production there, it's going to be a quality signing. Christian Fulton, we saw he started off really hot with the Chargers, but towards the end of the season, really kind of got picked on and exposed, and especially with the big explosive plays. He gave up at least 4 of those big explosive plays that really kind of changed the trajectory of football games. Elijah Mitchell doesn't really do much for me, the running back, maybe a good complimentary piece, but when you look at the players they lost and how much they contributed to this football team for the Chiefs and the players that they brought in, I think it's definitely a team that did not get better through free agency up to this point.
Yeah, I think that it's really hard to make that argument. Obviously, at left tackle, when you're the guy whose backup he was, Trent Williams, I mean, it's hard to get playing time, but it's not like they made it, he was so good that they tried him out at right tackle or whatever. So that could be a big upgrade for them. They're still having big losses. And I think the thing with Christian Fulton is it all did come back down to earth. You're paying him 2 years, $20 million. And he's going to Steve Spagnuolo, who's one of the best defensive coordinators of all time. So to think that he could, be better even than he was last season or be more consistent, it isn't crazy, even with how much of a wizard we know that Jesse Minter is. And he still played much better last year than he had for a while. But
he did.
The good play really faltered towards the end of the season. And what it turned into, David, was just an insane amount of penalties. I mean, 9 penalties he committed last year, including in the game where he kind of got dunked on by Xavier Worthy in the end zone while also pass interfering with him in the first matchup they had against the Chiefs. And I think a 55-yard, 54-yard touchdown. So Elijah Mitchell, Jerry Tillery, Christian Fulton, I don't know, nothing that moves the needle there. Big move to keep Trey Smith. He's a good player, and we would have, loved to have seen him on the Chargers, even with the warts that he has and the struggles he's had in the playoffs. But now I think the question becomes, did the Chargers gain ground? Did they lose ground? Did they keep pace? Because obviously we're most in tune with this, and the Chargers had more additions to this team because of the amount of unrestricted free agents out of all of these. So how do you feel, David, about where the Chargers kind of ended up in the AFC West scrum?
Well, when I look at the Chargers and what they did in free agency, I say, okay, how many obvious holes did they fix in free agency? How many positions do I feel markedly better about after what they've done? So offensive line, I feel better about it. They got Mekhi Becton. They brought in Andre James. You get a legitimate starter with Mekhi Becton and an obvious upgrade there. And you get somebody in Andre James who, if the scheme fit matches what he's played in the past, if he's able to play up to that production, that could be a significant upgrade as well. And at the very least, it upgrades the depth of the offensive line. So love that move. Najee Harris, just the model of consistency, a player who's been able to, grind out those yards and be available, never missed a game, is going to give you 1,000 yards rushing pretty much every single season. So I think that's a solid addition there. Tyler Conklin, a very good pass catching tight end, a veteran who's given you nothing but durability, availability, and some very, very sure hands. Mike Williams, I think that's the wild card there. Yeah. Mike Williams is the move that could take this from a free agency period being pretty good to either not so good or great. Because if you get 14, 15 games of quality health from Mike Williams, I can easily see him putting up some pretty big production given the comfortability and the connection that he has with Justin Herbert. So I think if you ask the question, did they get better? I think they got better. Did they get better enough to close the gap? Not quite yet. I think they still have work to do in the draft to be able to get to that next step that they want to go.
Yeah, well, a wise man once said, right, I'll see it when I believe it. Patrick Mahomes. It's going to, the Chargers to catch the Chiefs, we have to see it to believe it. And I think that all of these four teams went about their free agencies in a much different way just because of where they were at. And I think the most underrated part of what the Chargers did in free agency was keeping two guys that were key pieces of one of the top, if not the top defenses in the league last year, with Elijah Molden and Khalil Mack. Those were the core pieces they had to keep intact. They did have some big losses. Poona Ford is a big loss. We'll see how much of a loss Josh Palmer is, but it's not hard for me to imagine if Mike Williams stays healthy that he has a better season than the one we saw from Josh Palmer in 2024. Like, that doesn't seem out of the question. As he was wide receiver 3 for the Chargers last year. I think Mike Williams could improve upon the season that he had last year. So I think that could be something. You got those key supplemental weapons, but you got the big upgrades on the interior offensive line that you needed to give yourself the flexibility going into the draft, where at the end of the day, that's where they're going to have to make their big improvements is in the draft. That's where they're going to have to, with the philosophy they carry right now under Joe Ortiz, that is the way they gain ground, is through the draft. Free agency, keep it together, keep the parts that made you really good, and for the most part, they did that. But the draft is where, if you can find players the equivalent to Ladd McConkey, Joe Alt, Cam Hart, and Tarheeb Still, you have absolutely gained ground on the Kansas City Chiefs, depending on what they obviously do with their own draft picks. But that's where the Chargers are banking on their improvements and their major improvements coming from. But that comes with the risk, because you have to be able to hit on those guys.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, we will find out if not being more aggressive in this free agency period will come back to bite them. But they had a very specific plan, and they kept pace at the very least. And I think they made several key improvements to keep a roster that had 11 wins where they need to be, right? At least, at a really good spot going into the draft. But that is going to wrap things up for today's show. Make sure you're back here tomorrow for Fan Mail Friday, because we're going to be talking about one of the guys I've been really excited to dive in on the film for. If the Chargers wait on running back, could they come and try to get Cam Skattebo, a.k.a. Scatterbolt? That's what we're going to be talking about on tomorrow's show, but we have lots of room for other questions as well, so you can hit us up at LockedOnLAC, on Instagram at LockedOnChargers. We'll put a post out on YouTube as well, or you can hit us up in the comments. And you can also call into the voicemail line at 323-524-7924 and give us your 30-second Chargers question there. But we're really excited to get into it. To make sure you don't miss it, go subscribe or follow for free on the Locked On Chargers YouTube channel and listen wherever you get your podcast from, as well as finding us on all of the places where I said before, where we post the show every day on all of our social media, or on my Twitter at DanTalkSports and David's at DroTalkSD. But fun show today. Thank you to the everydayers out there. We'll be back with you guys tomorrow as the only daily Chargers podcast. But until then, take it easy and go Bolts.